Okay, hello everyone. So here we are in week 3, and we'll have one short timeline to start the week. And what you'll begin to see in this timeline is the First Amendment, as we think of it today, is just starting to emerge. Notice that in the first 2 timelines, the Founding Era and Civil War and Reconstruction, I didn't have a single First Amendment case to tell you about. And that's because the Supreme Court simply didn't interpret the First Amendment the way we think of it. And part of the reason is because of the wording. Congress shall make no law. That meant the First Amendment only applied at the federal level. States and localities were free to abridge your freedom of speech and freedom of the press all day long. And it wasn't a First Amendment violation, because there could only be a Supreme Court case, or there could only be a First Amendment case if it involved Congress making a law. So there wasn't much to do. The First Amendment didn't work at all during the 1800s. And so what we see is that beginning to change. So we start our timeline, and I'm going to step back so that I can zoom in and pan in a second. So we start our timeline. The defining event that started this era is 1914 with the beginning of World War I. And wars always tend to have ripple effects through society. And so we'll see that affect the progression or the evolution of the First Amendment. Now, right off the bat, and the reason I asked you to look at the trailer for Birth of a Nation is we get what is really our first important First Amendment case, and that's the Mutual Film case. It was Mutual Film versus Ohio Film Commission. So what was happening was Birth of a Nation was actually causing riots or fistfights or fights, and it wasn't imaginary or speculative. It really was causing fistfights. And so Ohio banned the movie, banned showing the movie. The filmmakers sued under the First Amendment, and they said not allowing us to show our movie is a prior restraint, and that violates our First Amendment rights. But here the court, they wanted to side in favor of the government, but they had to come up with a reason why a film wasn't protected by the First Amendment. They said film is not protected by the First Amendment because it is merely action. It's commerce. It's business. It's not speech. So it's not protected by the First Amendment. And that solidifies our first great dichotomy, and that's the speech-action dichotomy. And I'll talk about that in another video. Sorry. Then we get to 1917. And 2 important things happen. That is, first of all, the United States enters the war. And of course, that has many ripple effects. Second of all, and the first ripple effect was that Congress passed the Espionage Act. And so that was a way of throwing people in jail for things that they said or wrote, right? If they undermined the war effort, they were prosecuted under the Espionage Act, right? And we'll see that to this day, that law. We have whistleblower cases in the last 10 years in which people have been thrown in jail under the Espionage Act of 1917. So that law is alive and well. Next, the following year, and the Espionage Act mostly applied to government employees who said or wrote things that the government disliked. And the government wanted to be able to punish other people for saying things, non-government employees for saying and writing things that the government didn't like. And what really was happening was they needed a weapon or a way of punishing anti-war protesters. So they created the Sedition Act yet again, made it a crime to criticize the government. So once again, we get a third Sedition Act that made it a crime to criticize the government. Next, in 1919, and I'm getting a glare on the board, which I will correct. In 1919, we had a very famous moment because we got the Quartet of Cases. The Quartet of Cases, Schenck, Debs, Frohwerk, and Abrams, all of these people were anti-war protesters. All of these people also were either socialists or communists. And the government used the Sedition Act of 1918 as a weapon against them, and they were all thrown in jail. Now, in the Schenck, and these were not just fringe characters. Debs was Eugene Debs. He was the leader of the Socialist Party, which was actually quite large in the United States at this time. And he ran for president 4 times. The first time he ran for president, he got 12% of the popular vote, which is a lot. The 4th time that he ran for president from a jail cell. So imagine that. So, and all of these people were thrown in jail merely for speaking out against the war. Now, all of these people, their cases went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sided in favor of the government against these speakers in every single one of these cases. The first case, Schenck. So these people were literally speaking and writing, and so it was hard to see, and Congress had passed the Sedition Act. So you'd think, okay, this is a slam dunk. Congress made a law that abridged their freedom of speech and freedom of the press. But the court wanted to side in favor of the government, and they had to have a reason, and they came up with the word incitement. They said, your speech is not speech protected by the First Amendment. It's an action. It's incitement. And here's the definition of incitement. Incitement is speech that causes violence or lawless action. Speech that causes violence or lawless action. And the court in this case said that type of speech isn't speech protected by the First Amendment, it's action not protected. And they also added a test. They added the clear and present danger test. So that all they had to do was say, did this speech represent a clear and present danger? Yes, the speech represented a clear and present danger. Ta-da! And so all of these people stayed in jail. By the end, Holmes wrote that decision in the first place, but by the end of the year, he had had a change of heart. So when the Abrams case came up, Holmes wrote one of the most famous dissents in history, and it certainly was the first major, utterance of what the First Amendment should mean and what it should protect. So we have Holmes's famous dissent, and he gave us the idea of the marketplace of ideas. That is, we want freedom of speech because we want all of the ideas out there. We want all of these ideas to compete so that the best ideas will rise to the top. That idea, the marketplace of ideas, to this day is still one of the most important theories that the Supreme Court uses when it decides First Amendment cases. Now we go on to 1920. 2 famous things happen. First of all, for us as communication majors, we're interested in a new communication technology, and that was radio. Commercial radio began, KTKA. We also had our first radio news broadcast in 1920 out of Detroit. And then, of course, ladies, this is part of your heritage, the 19th Amendment is passed, and women finally get the right to vote. It's really hard to believe it when you think about it. That's not that long ago. 1920, less than 100 years ago, women finally got the right to vote. 1921, an important change at the Supreme Court. This was like back when we talked about when John Marshall came onto the court back in 1801. Taft came onto the court with, he wanted to increase the power and prestige of the court. What he saw in this era, think about the 19th Amendment and all that stands for. That stands for progress. That stands for societal change. And he saw all of this stuff. Remember, this was the go-go roaring 20s, right? We had the booming stock market, the jazz age, innovations in art and architecture and music. And he saw society changing in all these ways. Even the barriers between blacks and whites were beginning to fall. And he saw the court just sort of sitting on the sideline. And he wanted the court to be part of it, right? And so he gets to work on the court, and we get 3 legal milestones of 1925 that represent the court getting involved in the action. So first of all, Taft worked with allies in the Congress to pass a new Judiciary Act, and it's also nicknamed the Certiorari Act. That act created the concept of certiorari, and you know that that's the power of the court to pick and choose which cases it takes. Up until 1925, the Supreme Court had to take every single case, right? And so this was a way of elevating the prestige of the court, because now the court would only take important, or what it considered important cases. To this day, the court only takes about 100 cases per year. Gets thousands of requests, but only takes about 100 cases. So that makes each case seem a lot more important. The next thing was this, and Taft also engineered this. In 1925, a very important 14th Amendment case. Remember, our 14th Amendment timeline is the middle timeline. We get a case called Pierce v. Society of Sisters, and that was because the state of Oregon passed a law forcing all children to go to public school. It was an underhanded way, it was an anti-Catholic measure. They were targeting Catholic schools. So they were saying, no, children can't go to Catholic school, they have to go to public school. Society of Sisters is obviously nuns. They sued under the 14th Amendment, under the Due Process Clause. They went to the word liberty. They said liberty also includes the power to raise our children how we wish. So that is an example of substantive due process, also known as SDP. Well, we knew that from the Santa Clara case in 1886. That's how they used SDP to protect a railroad corporation. And a funny thing happened, and that was decade after decade, the court was using substantive due process under the 14th Amendment to protect corporations, not to protect African Americans. Suddenly, here's a sea change, and the Supreme Court begins using SDP to protect people. And that's more how we think of the 14th Amendment today. And then finally, Gitlow v. New York, an extremely important First Amendment case, because it gave us the concept of incorporation. And I'm going to jump out here and give you the definition. This is similar to substantive due process, but listen to the difference. Incorporation is the process by which the court incorporates parts of the Bill of Rights into the word liberty in the Due Process Clause in order to reach down to the state and local level. See, it's a difference in purpose. Substantive due process used the word liberty to create new rights, to give it new meaning. Incorporation uses the word liberty in order to get down to the state and local level. Because remember the wording of the 14th Amendment, no state shall. And so what they did here was they said the word liberty includes freedom of speech. And that means it applies at the state and local level. So suddenly this is a revolutionary change to the First Amendment. Up until this time, the First Amendment just did not apply very much. But now suddenly the court can reach down to the state and local level and start applying the First Amendment. And that's going to revolutionize First Amendment law. And then finally, this period comes to a crashing end with the stock market crash of 1929.